Shana Tova, everybody. This past summer, I joined over 200 rabbis from around the world in Jerusalem for 10 days of study, reflection, and conversation. And I gotta tell you, wow, those rabbis really know how to drink. That's just not true. But the most memorable moments from my time in Israel came when I skipped out of the program early one evening and headed to the recently built train station, where I hopped on a new train to Tel Aviv and joined over 140,000 Israelis on the streets protesting the government's proposed judicial reforms. With Israeli flags draped over their shoulders, they clung to signs calling for all different political causes, and the crowd roared with chants for democracy before the evening concluded with everyone joining in the singing of Israel's national anthem, Hatikva. A few days later, after I returned home, a New York Times interview with Natan Sharansky about the proposed reforms caught my eye. Many of us remember Sharansky as a hero, the symbol of the movement to free Soviet Jews. For 9 years locked up in Soviet prisons, his steadfast and unbendable will inspired us all. Here is what Sharansky, who favors reforming Israel's judiciary, said. The real drama is not in the specific proposals. The real drama is the fact that there is no serious mutual conversation. Natan Sharansky, a man known for strength and conviction, appealed for compromise. But amongst the calls from the coalition and the protests in the street, Sharansky's voice was drowned out. That's what makes the situation in Israel so very frustrating and even heartbreaking. Culturally speaking, there is no longer one united Israel. Instead, Israel has become a bifurcated society, divided between the Orthodox Zionists and the black hat-wearing ultra-Orthodox on one side of the divide, and a democratically inclined secularists on the other side. With that new high-speed train connecting the religious Jerusalem and the secular Tel Aviv, it has never been easier to travel between the two cities. And yet, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem have never been further apart. I suspect that this is why Sharansky's call for dialogue struck such a chord with me. It goes far beyond judicial reform. More than Iran, Hezbollah, ISIS in Syria, or a seemingly unresolvable conflict with the Palestinians, Israel's greatest existential threat is the widening chasm, the growing distance between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And if the only connection between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv is a high-speed train, the experiment of a Jewish democratic state will tragically conclude in failure. It's not only in Israel. The widening aisle that our politicians are unwilling or unable to reach across has paved its path out of Washington, D.C., and into our living rooms and lives. We know just how hard it is to talk with people with whom we have profound differences. And with a season of court cases and a presidential campaign staring us down in the calendar, this may very well be the final moments before the storm. And so today, with all of that in mind, I want to discuss what we should do with our disagreements. To begin, I want to show you some of the stickers that I collected at that rally in Tel Aviv. It's a social experiment of sorts. Here they are. This one says, Chilonim lo avadim, which means secular people, not slaves. And it's, of course, a reference to Pharaoh and our slavery in Egypt. Here's the second one. Lo nisheret dictator. We don't serve a dictator. And here's the third one. On the bottom is a picture of members of the current cabinet. And it says on the top, Memshelet HaBiza, which means a looting government. My guess is that each of you had strong reactions to what I shared. And if I stood up here and tried to convince you why these stickers were either totally correct or totally off base, I would change none of your minds. Here's why. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist at NYU, shows in his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, that most of the time people are not swayed by sweeping speeches, changed by impassioned charges, or convinced by well-reasoned arguments. According to Haidt, people have almost instantaneous reactions to what they see, read, or hear. They're reactions that come from the gut. In Yiddish, it's from your kishkas. And attempts to try and persuade or change someone's emotional reaction most often results in frustration and can even push someone further away from the position that you are hoping for them to adopt. So if attempts at logical and persuasive argumentation, like sermons, rarely change people's minds, how should we encounter people with whom we have serious disagreements? Today, I want to present 3 different ways of dealing with disagreement from the Talmud. The first approach comes from a story that involves nasty accusations, a few cups of wine, and an explosion. According to the story, a common man comes to the great Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who compiled the Mishnah. And this man ignored all of the respect due to this great sage. He approaches Yehuda HaNasi in public and in front of everyone. He crassly declares, "Your wife is my wife, and your children are my children." The rabbi turns to the brute and offers him a glass of wine, which the man accepts and drinks. Here's where the story gets bizarre. After finishing the cup of wine, the man explodes and dies. Now, this clearly leaves an impression on the other rabbis, because when Rabbi Chia is approached by a different man with the same crass allegations, Rabbi Chia takes one out of Yehuda HaNasi's playbook. Chia offers the man a glass of wine, the man drinks it, and guess what? He too explodes and dies. The Talmud then relates that the rabbis could not tolerate aspersions cast upon their children, and that is why they offer the exploding wine. From this, we learn that if you cross the cantor or eye, think twice before coming to the bima to make kiddush. But if we don't allow ourselves to get distracted by the bizarre details, the text is teaching something very important. When we are confronted by someone with offensive and demeaning accusations, we can, in a matter of speaking, blow them up. In other words, we can do anything in our power to discredit them and their position. There are times when this is necessary, when the gloves need to come off, and nothing short of total denunciation of both person and position will do. Our second approach is famously held by the rabbinic sage Shammai. In the Talmud, there is a long narrative that explains how Shammai reacts to those approaching him with ridiculous and even offensive questions. According to this piece, Shammai is approached by 3 different men seeking to convert to Judaism. But in each case, the person makes their conversion contingent upon an absurd and openly antagonistic request. One man expresses a willingness to convert if Shammai agrees only to teach him the Bible and nothing from the Talmud. A second man, he comes up to Shammai and he says, I'll convert if you promise to make me the high priest at the temple in Jerusalem. And most famously, a third man agrees to convert if Shammai teaches him the essence of Judaism while he can stand on one foot. In response to each of these ridiculous requests, rather than engage the person, Shammai chases these men away. And Shammai's approach, a refusal to engage either the person or the position, like the exploding wine, has its place. But today, I would like us to consider that we have offered one another too many cups of exploding wine. And like Shammai, we have chased away too many people. How many cups of exploding wine are too many? And how many people are we willing to chase out of our lives? There's another approach that I'd like for us to consider today. Of course, we're not going to be able to get there all of the time. It would be naive and perhaps dangerous if we did. Instead, let's look at this approach not as a universal expectation, but as a soulful aspiration. It's offered as a counterpoint to Shammai. The Talmud presents Hillel. And after each of these potential converts is dismissed by Shammai, Hillel meets them all. He doesn't disqualify them for their ludicrous and demeaning demands, but instead he skillfully works with them despite their demands. He doesn't sacrifice who he is or what he believes, but by establishing a relationship with each of these men, ever so slowly, each of these rebel rousers begin to change. Hillel doesn't yell from the bima or offer heady logical refutations. Instead, Hillel begins conversations. As relationships form, the potential converts gradually evolve. And I imagine so does Hillel. And through this approach, Hillel teaches something critical for us to understand. Only once we connect to the soul can we convince the mind. every time we blow someone up like the rabbis with the wine, and every time we walk away like Shammai, we take one step closer to purifying our carefully curated social silos. On the other hand, approaching someone like Hillel with an openness to creating connection despite all that we detest, that is where there is virtue. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, confirms the value of a Hillel-type engagement, while simultaneously affirming just how difficult it is. Haidt writes, if you really want to change someone's mind on a moral or political matter, you'll need to see things from that person's angle as well as your own. And if you do truly see it the other person's way, deeply and intuitively, you might even find your own mind opening in response. Empathy is an antidote to righteousness, although it's very difficult to empathize across a moral divide. The unique blend of patience and calm necessary for a Hillel-type approach may be a scarce treasure buried in the recesses of our souls. But if we don't ever reach for Hillel, if we dismiss his approach as naive, we are sacrificing more than a lofty ideal. We are resigning ourselves to live lives where forever we preach to the choir. That is too simply too sad a life to live. We must challenge ourselves, not all the time, but at least some of the time, to summon the virtue of Hillel to help bring us together, especially when it's hard, especially when it's challenging. And that's why this year, under the leadership of Lena LeBeau, Jill Lasker, and Gary Wexler, we are beginning a series of intimate dinners at people's homes where we talk politics, but we emphasize connection and listening. We're calling it Holy Disagreements. The first one is going to take place in the Sukkah in just a few weeks. And eventually, we hope that many of you in our community will participate. This morning, I want to close with a story. Derek Black was raised in the white nationalist movement. His father was the founder of the country's largest white nationalist website, Stormfront, and his godfather was David Duke. Derek was raised with the belief that America was for white people, and eventually everyone else would have to leave. Without ever explicitly condoning racism, Derek became the face of the next generation of white nationalists. Clean-cut, well-spoken, and interested in cleaning up the country, Derek's popularity grew as he was elected to a local political office and even began hosting a radio show with his father. Following high school, Derek wanted to study medieval European history, and because of its well-respected program, he went to the New College of Florida, which is also known for its gay culture and wide acceptance of marijuana. Once enrolled at the new college, Derek kept his white nationalist views hidden. With friends of all races, including one Orthodox Jew named Matthew Stevenson, Derek would gather and socialize and watch zombie movies in the evening. Yet later that night, Derek would always sneak away from his college friends and find a private place where he would call into his radio show back home. This double life didn't last for long before Derek was outed on campus. Once his identity became known, many former friends and classmates took the exploding wine approach. They blasted all the ugliness that Derek ever espoused and completely eviscerated him personally. Others took the Shammai approach, choosing not to engage Derek at all, but instead to completely ignore him. But that one Orthodox Jewish student, Matthew Stevenson, had a different approach. When Matthew read about Derek and his extremist and anti-Semitic views, he concluded that he could only possibly change someone with those views if he really got to know them. So while everyone else at the new college either blew Derek up or completely ostracized him, Matthew Stevenson invited Derek Black to Shabbat dinner. It was the only social invitation Derek received in months. So Derek went to the dinner. That evening, there was no great reveal. There was no great change of heart. But Shabbat after Shabbat, Matthew kept inviting Derek, and Derek kept coming. Eventually, Derek began to share at the Shabbos table, first about courses and life on campus, and then eventually about his extremist views. And as people at the Shabbat dinner began to open up to Derek, people noticed Derek softening his positions. And then, one night, a year or so later, with graduation on the horizon, Derek published the following letter. After a great deal of thought, I have resolved that it is in the best interests of everyone involved to be honest about my slow but steady disaffiliation from white nationalism. I can't support a movement that tells me I can't be a friend to whomever I wish, or that other people's race requires me to think of them in a certain way or be suspicious at their advancements. I am sorry for the damage done. A boy steeped in white nationalism, swayed to a different direction, not from stirring speeches or coherently synthesized arguments, but because of the kind invitation to Shabbat dinners from Matthew Stevenson, a modern-day Hillel. Today, as we mark Rosh Hashanah 5784, we are hopeful that the new year affords us opportunities to bring some sweetness, even as we gird ourselves for a year that is certain to be filled with derision and division on the national and world stage. While we enter the new year holding firm to what we believe to be correct and right, too often and too quickly, we have offered the exploding wine of total denunciation. And too often and too quickly, we have outrightly dismissed those whose positions challenge, annoy, and even antagonize. Therefore, this year, let us reach for the virtue of Hillel by connecting, not convincing. If Matthew Stevenson can reach out to Derek Black, we can certainly reach out to one another. Shana Tova.